Hey guys, it's Alex and I'm here with my January wrap-up. I've already filmed this video once, so hopefully this time it will be more succinct, but my lighting was terrible and I just decided I couldn't post that video. So we're refilming and maybe this will get my thoughts a little bit more coherent. I had a really good reading month in January. I got through 11 books, which made me really happy. That's a couple books more than I really aspire to. I kind of like to hit around 8 books, so I'm very happy with that, and I also had a lot of really good quality books. I had a number of high ratings this month, so overall, just a really great month. I also don't have any reviews out for these books yet. I promise I will get these filmed and up at some point, but I'm very behind on my reviewing and my filming, so it may be a minute before you see these full reviews. The first book that I read was Into Thin Air by Krakauer. I buddy read this with cozy reader Kelly and we both really enjoyed it. She gave it 5 stars and I gave it 4 stars. This is a non-fiction account about a 1996 expedition to Mount Everest, which was one of the deadliest years in Mount Everest's history. Krakauer was actually on the expedition where a number of people died. This was a really heartbreaking story. I was surprised by how much I cared, because I'm not very much into nature stories or adventure stories or explorer type stories. I don't find myself caring too much about those. I don't know anything about Everest apart from what the average person would know, and I don't really have any specific interest in those kind of things. But Krakauer wrote this in a very easy to follow way. I never felt confused about what he was saying or what was happening, and he made it all very, very interesting. I definitely didn't expect to care this much, and I didn't expect to be so heartbroken about the deaths. He did such an amazing job of crafting the story and introducing these people and getting you to care about them. And I read a number of nonfiction and I don't find myself too sad. Like, you go in, you know people are gonna die. You know who's gonna die even. He introduced the people almost like they were characters and you got to know them sort of in that way. And it didn't feel like a nonfiction account. He was telling this amazing, interesting, heartbreaking story and I absolutely adored it. This is a nonfiction book I'd highly recommend, even if you normally only read fiction. The next book I read was The Unseen World by Liz Moore. This was the audiobook I was listening to for most of December and January. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. It was one of my favorite books from last year, and it's still a favorite. I don't think I enjoyed the audiobook experience quite as much as I enjoyed reading the physical book, but it was still very worthwhile and such a wonderful story. This is a historical fiction novel about a girl who grows up in 1980s Boston. When she's around 13, her father is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she goes to live with a family friend and one of his colleagues. The story follows her self-discovery and her realization that her father isn't exactly who he's always claimed to be. It's so heartbreaking and touching, and such a wonderfully compelling story. I get into that story and I can't get out. It's so well done. It's so well written. It's just utterly beautiful in every way, and I already want to reread it again. That was the first time I'd reread it in almost a year, and it's been about a year since I read it the first time, and I just really want to pick it up again. I followed that with another book that I started in January, and that was Without You by Anthony Rapp. This is Anthony Rapp's memoir, and I gave it 5 stars. He was one of the original stars of Rent. He was also in the movie. This book focuses on the time period in his 20s where he was starring in Rent, and basically Rent was just beginning, and his mother was also dying of cancer. It's such a beautiful story. I loved this. It was so heartbreaking. I spent so much time crying. It took me several weeks to finish this book. Not so much because it was difficult to read, but because I kept crying so hard that I'd have to put it down. And I definitely wasn't expecting it to be that emotional. Most books like this are 4 stars for me in that they're very entertaining, they're worthwhile reads, but they're not absolute favorites. But this was a favorite. The only caveat to this book is that I don't think it'd be worth it if you're not already a fan of Anthony Rapp or Rent. I think if you do love one of those two things, I highly recommend this book. It was so worthwhile. But if you're not, then I don't think this is going to be a book that you would really enjoy or get much out of. Cammy's Corner and Joni Reads hosted a true crime read-along, which they're planning to do bi-monthly, called Crime Scene. I highly recommend checking out because the live show was very fun. And for that, I read I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. This is obviously a true crime book about the Golden State Killer, and Michelle McNamara's search to figure out who he is and investigate it on her own. And it was very interesting in that regard, but I gave it 4 stars. I was very torn on the rating of this book because while it was very interesting, it was also very clearly unfinished. And I did enjoy it. I enjoyed the research that she did and her life and her as a person. And I love that people finished this book so that we got to experience that. But as a book, I really couldn't judge it as a completed work of literature because it isn't. It would be like reading a diary that was published posthumously, and you can't read that as a completed work of literature either because it's something else. And I did find this book worthwhile, but the unfinished aspect and the way it was structurally set up because of that really wasn't the best for me, and that did sort of keep me from giving it 5 stars, and it sort of hampered my enjoyment just a little bit. But still a really great read. And then for the BookTube Rereadathon, which I am hosting, and the link for that will be down below if you would like any more information, I read The Song of the Lioness Quartet. I am a bit of an overachiever and have been very excited to reread these, so I reread all 4 books instead of just the first one, which was Alanna the First Adventure, which I gave 5 stars, In the Hand of the Goddess, which I gave 4 stars, The Woman Who Rides Like a Man, which I gave 5 stars, and Lioness Rampant, which I gave 5 stars. This series is one of my favorites. I absolutely adore it. I've read it so many times. I first read it when I was about 12, and for that reason, it has such nostalgia for me. It's like going home, even more than Harry Potter is, honestly, just because this world is so special and unique to me. Alanna is a wonderful character. The story is essentially a young girl wants to become a knight, but she lives in a sexist, typical medieval world where girls can't become knights, only boys can. So she switches places with her brother and pretends to be a boy for many years in order to become a knight. And the books follow her from about age 10 through her early 20s as she becomes a knight and goes on many adventures and fights evil and all the sort of typical fantasy things. There's so much fun. The only thing I would say that's sort of a detriment to them is that they were written in the 80s, and they do have a lot of 80s issues in them. Like the way gender roles are written in the story is very sexist, and it's very 80s feminist instead of like what we would consider modern day feminist. The relationships kind of have their difficulties when it comes to consent, and the white savior trope was just really awful to read. But I do think I'm much more forgiving of these books because they were from the 80s, and also I've read Tamora Pierce's more recent works as she has progressed as an author, and she's definitely changed her views and gotten so much better about things. So I would still highly recommend these books, and the experience of rereading them was just so much fun. And at this point in the month, everything I'd read had been either 4 or 5 stars, which is a lot for me, and it was very overwhelming, so I picked up something that I really didn't think I was going to love that much, but would just be like a fun, easy read that I wouldn't care too much about, and that was A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallaro. I gave this book 2 stars. This is a young adult contemporary novel that's a modern day retelling of Sherlock Holmes about Sherlock Holmes and Watson's ancestors, descendants. Charlotte Holmes and Jamie Watson meet at a boarding school in Connecticut and basically go on adventures together. I wanted to like this book, and I kind of did in some ways. The story and the writing were not great, but they were entertaining enough that I was going to give this book 3 stars. But by the time I got to the end, it ended on such a sour note for me, and there were so many issues throughout the book that I found I couldn't really justify the 3-star rating, and I gave it 2 stars. I didn't like the way Charlotte's rape was dealt with. It felt very much like a plot device that didn't impact her character or the story at all. I didn't like Jamie's anger issues or the way those were dealt with. It felt like the story hit on a lot of sensitive topics and unhealthy relationships and things like that, but never actually dealt with them, either in a positive or a negative way. They just existed, and I really didn't like that. And then the women hating women trope was kind of the final straw. I'm just very tired of that, and it's boring and old to me when it lacks nuance. And I felt like most of this book just lacked nuance. And then because I already had it, I picked up The Last of August by Brittany Cavallaro. Also gave this 2 stars. I had pretty much the same thoughts, except I thought this one was worse. It was very boring and convoluted, where the first one at least entertained me and kept me going through the story. I just slogged through this, and I really didn't like August's role in this book. It felt very uncomfortable to me that this 22-year-old was hanging out with and friends with a bunch of 16-year-olds. And the way that a romantic relationship between him and Charlotte, who was 16, was teased throughout the book made me very, very uncomfortable. I've worked with high school kids a few years ago when I'd have been about the same age as August, and when you're 22 dealing with high school kids, they really do seem like children to you. There's enough of an age gap there that when you're working with them, You are the adult. You don't get to be, oh, I'm just 6 years older or so. You're the adult, and I don't think that was written very well in this book. And if it had been intended to be an unhealthy relationship, or if it had been dealt with in any way, I'd have been okay with that, but it wasn't, and I just really didn't like this at all, and it honestly was way too convoluted to be a good mystery. And the final book I read, and the only book I read for Tome Infinity and Beyond, was Meg by Steve Alten. I gave this 3 stars. This is about a giant prehistoric shark who basically escapes from the bottom of the ocean and terrorizes people. This book is bad. I don't usually say that, but it's so poorly written, and there are a lot of issues that I had with this book. It was very boring, first of all. There were a lot of long descriptions about procedures and equipment and things like that weren't really descriptions, they were just a list of facts about the thing. And that was very boring to me and really didn't make a lot of sense for someone who doesn't know anything about the ocean or boats or whatever. It was also kind of sexist in the only 2 female characters, and the writing in general was just not good. But I gave it 3 stars because the action in this book was so much fun. It was such ridiculous action that it made it so dumb that it was fun again. And that was what I really liked about this book, because I was all set to give it 2 stars. But I just had so much fun reading it, especially like the last half of the book. Whenever it got to the action just made it worthwhile. Like, one surfer dude literally just surfed into the open mouth of this giant shark. That was fun to me. It's ridiculous, but fun. And there were so many cliches in this book, like really painfully obvious cliches. Like the Navy guy who said he was 30 hours away from retirement. Like, we all know the second that dude is introduced, he's about to die. He's not going to make it more than another 30 or 40 pages. And he doesn't. And I don't think that's a spoiler, because obviously. But it was so ridiculous that it was fun, and I really enjoyed it and couldn't justify giving it less than 3 stars. But it was also not a very good book, and I'm not going to continue the series, so this was kind of a one-off, but honestly very worthwhile for me. And I forgot to mention that I'm not going to be continuing the Charlotte Holmes series either. I honestly only read The Last of August because I already owned it. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, or what you thought of them if you had, and if you're planning to read any of these books. I will hopefully be doing full reviews on most of them in the coming month or 2, so definitely look out for that if you're interested in anything specific. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.